The night he laughed at his wife was the night the world learned her name. The crystal chandeliers of the Harrington Foundation Gala cast a soft, golden glow across the grand ballroom, scattering light like fragments of quiet power over marble floors and tailored silhouettes worth more than most homes in America, and yet in the middle of that polished perfection stood a woman no one seemed to notice. Naomi Carter moved with calm precision, her black silk gown simple but deliberate, no glitter, no diamonds loud enough to beg for attention, just a quiet elegance that seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it, as if she didn't need the room's approval to exist within it. At 5'7" she carried herself taller than most of the women draped in couture around her, her shoulders steady, her gaze level, her presence composed in a way that didn't ask for permission. Across the room the whispers had already begun, subtle at first, then sharper, like champagne bubbles rising to the surface. "That's her," one voice murmured behind a glass of rosé. "Harrington's wife," another added, disbelief wrapped in a smile too polite to be kind. Naomi heard them, of course she did, but her expression never shifted. She adjusted the thin strap of her gown with slow, controlled grace, as though the noise around her belonged to another world entirely, because in many ways it did. At precisely 8:32 p.m., the music softened, and the attention of the room pivoted toward the stage where William Harrington stood beneath a halo of warm light. 6'2", tailored tuxedo, every inch the billionaire they had come to admire, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that had closed deals across continents and built an empire from calculated risk and relentless ambition. He smiled as the applause rose, confident, effortless, the kind of man who had never once doubted that the world would bend in his direction, and tonight was no exception. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured, commanding, "thank you for joining us for a night dedicated to vision, legacy, and the future." His words flowed like currency, polished and persuasive, but there was something beneath them, something colder, something that only those closest to him would recognize, and Naomi, standing near the edge of the room, recognized it immediately. She had seen that tone before, felt it in quieter rooms where no one else was watching, where admiration turned into evaluation, where partnership slowly became distance, where love, if it had ever truly existed, became something transactional. William's eyes scanned the crowd, acknowledging investors, board members, familiar faces that validated his world, and then, almost as an afterthought, his gaze found Naomi, just for a second, just long enough for something unreadable to pass between them, not warmth, not pride, something closer to calculation, the kind that weighs value against perception. And then he smiled again, wider this time, as if a decision had been made. "And tonight," he continued, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom, "I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone very special." A subtle shift rippled through the crowd, curiosity sharpening. Naomi didn't move, didn't react, but there was a stillness around her now, like the air itself had paused. William extended his hand toward the floor, his gesture precise, intentional. "Naomi," he called, his tone light, almost amused, "why don't you join me up here?" A few heads turned immediately, others followed, the whispers returning, louder now, more focused. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, just a second, and in that second something unspoken passed between them. Not fear, not hesitation, something steadier, something rooted deeper than the room could understand. And then she moved, each step measured, heels soft against the marble, the sound nearly swallowed by the anticipation building in the air. She ascended the steps without rush, without performance, as if she had always belonged there, even if no one else believed it yet. William watched her approach, his smile unwavering, but his eyes sharper now, as though he were preparing to deliver something more than just recognition, something that would entertain, impress, reinforce the narrative the room had already accepted. Naomi stopped beside him, her posture straight, her expression calm, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, the room held its breath, waiting, not for her, but for what he would do next, because in a room built on power, perception was everything, and tonight, perception was about to be rewritten. The applause that followed her arrival was polite, uncertain, the kind reserved for moments no one fully understood. William's hand hovered near the small of Naomi's back but never touched her, as if even that simple gesture required justification. He was no longer willing to offer. He turned slightly toward the audience, his smile widening just enough to signal confidence, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, something curated, something designed. "This," he said, gesturing toward Naomi with a casual ease that felt rehearsed, "is my wife." The words landed with a ripple of curiosity, heads tilted, glasses paused midair, the room leaned in, waiting, because in a world like this, introductions were rarely just introductions, they were statements of value, of hierarchy, of belonging. Naomi stood beside him without speaking, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her expression composed, unreadable, the light from above catching the smooth line of her cheek, reflecting not vulnerability but control. William chuckled softly, the sound amplified just enough through the microphone to carry. "I know what some of you are thinking," he continued, his tone shifting toward something lighter, almost playful. "She does not exactly fit the usual Harrington profile." A few scattered laughs broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger as others joined, encouraged by the permission in his voice. Naomi did not move, did not blink, her stillness more commanding than any reaction could have been. William glanced at her briefly, as if expecting something, a smile, a protest, anything that would validate the narrative he was constructing, but she gave him nothing, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes, not doubt, but irritation, quickly buried beneath another polished grin. "Naomi has always had a unique way of seeing the world," he added, pausing just long enough for the room to lean into the implication, "which I suppose is admirable, in its own way." The laughter came easier now, more confident, the kind that echoed off crystal and marble, carried by people who had built their lives on recognizing and reinforcing unspoken rules. Naomi's gaze moved slowly across the crowd, not searching for approval, not seeking escape, simply observing, as if she were memorizing the exact moment every expression changed, every person revealed themselves. Her silence stretched, not awkward, not fragile, but deliberate, the kind that forced the noise around it to reveal its own emptiness. William continued, encouraged by the response. "When we first met, I thought it was refreshing," he said, his tone softening just enough to suggest nostalgia. "Someone so unpolished, so outside of all this." He gestured vaguely to the room, the chandeliers, the wealth, the power. It felt real. Another pause, another calculated breath. "But as you all know, reality and refinement do not always align." This time the laughter was louder, more assured. A few heads nodded, others exchanged knowing glances. The message had landed exactly where he intended it to. Naomi finally shifted, just slightly, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch, her shoulders settling back with quiet precision, not in defense, but in alignment, as though she was stepping more fully into herself rather than shrinking away. William noticed, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly, but he pressed on, because stopping now would mean acknowledging something he did not yet understand. "I suppose every man needs a reminder of where he started," he concluded, his voice steady, his smile unwavering, "and Naomi has certainly been that for me." The room responded with a mix of laughter and applause, the kind that blurred the line between entertainment and endorsement, and yet beneath it all, something had shifted, something subtle, something not yet visible but already moving. Naomi turned her head slightly toward William, her eyes meeting his for the first time since she stepped onto the stage. There was no anger there, no embarrassment, no plea for understanding, only clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be heard. And for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, William's smile faltered, just enough for the illusion to crack, just enough for the air around them to tighten. Naomi then looked back out at the audience, her gaze steady, unwavering, and in that silence, something far more powerful than laughter began to take shape, because the room, whether it realized it or not, was no longer reacting to him, it was beginning to watch her. The laughter lingered a second too long, echoing against the high ceilings as if the room itself was trying to convince itself it was still in control, but something beneath it had already begun to fracture, subtle at first, like a shift in temperature no one could quite name. Naomi remained still, her gaze steady, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the entire room without effort. And it was in that stillness that the first crack appeared, a single pause in the crowd where one voice did not join the laughter, then another, until the sound that had once felt unified began to scatter into something uncertain. William felt it before he fully understood it, a slight tightening in his chest, a flicker of imbalance in a space he had always commanded. He adjusted his cufflink with a controlled motion, a habit born from years of maintaining composure under pressure. But this was different. This was not a negotiation or a boardroom dispute. This was something less predictable, less obedient. Naomi took a single step forward, not away from him, not toward the audience, but into the light itself, the chandelier above catching the smooth fabric of her gown, turning its darkness into something luminous rather than invisible. Her movement was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet it redirected the attention of the entire room, not with force, but with inevitability, the kind that does not ask for attention but claims it. William's smile remained in place. But it no longer reached his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to continue, to regain control of the narrative, but before he could speak, a soft voice cut through the space. "Mr. Harrington." It came from the side of the stage, measured, professional, and entirely out of rhythm with the performance unfolding. The event coordinator, a woman in a navy dress with a tablet held tightly in her hands, stepped forward just enough to be seen, her expression carefully neutral, but her presence disruptive in a way that could not be ignored. William turned toward her, a hint of annoyance sharpening his features. "Not now," he said under his breath, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that usually ended conversations before they began. But she did not retreat. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her voice lowered but still carrying enough urgency to shift the air. "Sir, there has been an update to the program," she said, choosing her words with precision. "The Foundation Board has requested an immediate acknowledgement." William's brow furrowed, confusion threading through his irritation. "That can wait," he replied, dismissive, already turning back toward the audience. But the coordinator did not move, her stillness mirroring Naomi's in a way that felt oddly aligned. "It cannot," she said quietly, and this time, there was no hesitation in her tone. The microphone in William's hand picked up just enough of the exchange to carry a faint echo through the speakers, and the room, already shifting, leaned in again, not with amusement this time, but with attention. William exhaled slowly, forcing a smile back into place as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a small adjustment to the evening," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier polish, though the edges were no longer as smooth. The coordinator handed him a card, her fingers steady, her gaze unwavering, and for a brief moment, their hands hovered in the same space, a silent transfer of something far more significant than a piece of paper. William glanced down at the card, expecting routine details, a name, a donor acknowledgement, something predictable, something safe, but as his eyes moved across the text, the color drained from his expression so quickly it was almost imperceptible. Almost. The room did not yet understand what had changed, but it felt it, like a shift in gravity. Naomi watched him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a calm recognition, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, not to expose him, but to allow the truth to arrive on its own terms. William's fingers tightened slightly around the card, the crisp edge bending just enough to betray the control he was trying to maintain. He lifted his gaze back to the audience, the smile returning, but now it was thinner, more deliberate. "It appears," he began, his voice steady but quieter, "that we have the honor of recognizing a key contributor to tonight's event." A murmur rippled through the crowd, curiosity replacing judgment, anticipation replacing amusement. William paused, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, everything shifted, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer speaking from certainty, he was reading from something he had not written, something he could not control. And as the silence stretched, Naomi stood beside him, unchanged, unshaken. The same woman they had laughed at moments ago, and yet now, somehow, entirely different, because the room was no longer seeing her through him, it was beginning to see her on her own. The silence that followed his pause was no longer uncertain, it was expectant, the kind that settles over a room when something unseen is about to become undeniable. William held the card between his fingers as if it weighed more than paper should, his eyes scanning the words. Again, slower this time, as though repetition might change their meaning, but it did not. The truth remained fixed, unyielding, and for the first time that evening, he felt it, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable loss of control. He drew in a measured breath, the kind he had used in negotiations worth hundreds of millions, and lifted his gaze back to the audience. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier ease, "we recognize a principal benefactor whose contribution has made this entire event possible." The words sounded correct, practiced, but something beneath them had shifted. The room felt it, a subtle tightening, a collective awareness that the tone had changed, the laughter from moments ago now distant, almost inappropriate in hindsight. William continued, each word chosen carefully. "The Harrington Foundation is honored to partner with an organization that has not only pledged significant financial support, but has also committed to long-term initiatives that will redefine access to education and healthcare across multiple states." A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, but focused, the kind that signals attention rather than distraction. Naomi remained beside him, still, composed, her presence now central rather than peripheral. no longer framed by him but standing parallel to him, equal in height not in inches but in gravity. William's grip on the card tightened again, the edge bending slightly more, a small, almost invisible detail that betrayed the pressure building beneath his controlled exterior. This organization, he continued, his voice dipping just enough to carry weight, has chosen to remain relatively private. A slight pause, just enough to acknowledge what the room was already beginning to suspect. Until tonight, the final word landed with precision, and in that moment, every eye in the ballroom sharpened, attention narrowing into something almost tangible. William turned his head, slowly, deliberately, toward Naomi, the motion no longer casual, no longer part of a performance, but something closer to acknowledgement, or perhaps realization. The light caught her face again, highlighting the calm in her expression, the absence of reaction, as if this moment did not define her but merely revealed her. And then, with a voice that no longer belonged entirely to him, William said her name, Naomi Carter. It echoed through the room, clear, unmistakable, and for a brief second, time seemed to pause, the name settling into the air like a key turning in a lock, unlocking something the room had not been prepared to face. A ripple moved through the crowd, not laughter this time, not even whispers, but recognition, sharp and immediate, the kind that shifts posture, that straightens backs, that recalibrates perception in real time. Naomi stepped forward, just one step, and the movement carried more authority than any introduction could have. She did not reach for the microphone, did not interrupt, did not rush, she simply stood in the light, fully visible now, fully undeniable. William swallowed, the motion subtle but real, his voice continuing, though it no longer led, it followed. Founder and chairwoman of Carter Global Initiatives. The words felt heavier now, each one carrying a weight that pressed into the room. Carter Global, the name alone was enough, known in private circles, respected in sectors that valued results over visibility, a force that had quietly reshaped industries without ever seeking the spotlight. And now, that force stood beside him, not introduced as an extension of his world, but as something entirely her own. The shift was immediate, visible in the way heads turned, in the way eyes widened, in the way silence replaced assumption. Naomi's gaze moved across the audience, meeting eyes that moments ago had dismissed her, and in that gaze there was no accusation, no need to confront, only clarity, the kind that makes people confront themselves. William lowered the card slightly, his role in the moment dissolving with each passing second. He was no longer the center, no longer the voice that defined the room. He was standing beside something he had failed to recognize, and the room knew it. The power had shifted, not with noise, not with force, but with truth, quiet, precise, and irreversible. Naomi finally moved again, her hand lifting toward the microphone, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled grace that had defined her from the moment she entered. And as her fingers closed around it, the entire room leaned in, not because they were told to, but because they understood, instinctively, that whatever came next would not be something they could laugh at, but something they would have to remember. Naomi's fingers rested lightly around the microphone, and for a moment, she did not speak, the silence stretching just long enough to command every ounce of attention in the room, not through force, but through presence, the kind that does not need to announce itself to be felt. Her gaze moved slowly across the audience, not searching, not seeking validation, simply acknowledging what had already changed. The same faces that had laughed now held something different, curiosity, unease, recognition. She drew in a quiet breath, steady, controlled, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. Good evening. The simplicity of the words carried more weight than any elaborate introduction, because they were not spoken to impress, they were spoken to establish. The room listened, truly listened. I appreciate your time tonight, she continued, her tone even, without edge, without apology, and I appreciate the work this foundation represents. She did not look at William when she said it, did not need to, the distance between them now defined not by space, but by understanding. A few people in the front rows shifted slightly, leaning forward, their earlier confidence replaced by attention sharpened into something almost cautious. Naomi allowed a brief pause, not to create drama, but to let the moment settle. Carter Global Initiatives was built on a very simple idea, she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room, that access should not be determined by perception. The words landed softly, but they lingered, threading through the air in a way that required reflection rather than reaction. A man near the back lowered his glass slowly, another adjusted his stance, subtle movements that signaled the room was no longer performing, it was absorbing. Naomi continued, for the past 10 years, we have invested in programs that prioritize potential over presentation, that measure value by impact rather than appearance. Her eyes moved again, meeting a few gazes directly now, not challenging, not accusing, simply present. And tonight's partnership is an extension of that commitment. She shifted her weight slightly. The movement small, controlled, the fabric of her gown catching the light again, no longer understated, but unmistakably intentional. William stood beside her, silent now, his role reduced to presence rather than authority, the contrast between them no longer subtle. Naomi's voice softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in precision. I understand that rooms like this are built on expectation, she said. On shared understanding of what belongs and what does not. A few eyes dropped. Others held steady, but none returned to laughter. The shift was complete. But expectation is not the same as truth, she added, and this time, the words carried a quiet finality, the kind that does not invite argument. Naomi paused again, her gaze briefly lifting toward the chandeliers above, the same lights that had once reflected judgment now illuminating clarity. I did not come here tonight to correct anyone, she continued, her tone unchanged, and I did not come here to prove anything. Her eyes lowered back to the audience, steady, unwavering, because what is real does not require permission to exist. The statement settled into the room like a line drawn in calm, deliberate ink, no sharpness, no aggression, just certainty. A woman near the front nodded almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing something she could not yet fully articulate. Naomi allowed the silence to hold for a moment longer, then added, respect is not something that can be assigned by a room. Her voice neither raised nor softened, simply clear. It is something that reveals itself when the room is no longer deciding. The words did not accuse, but they did not need to. They reframed everything that had happened without ever naming it directly, and that was what made them undeniable. William shifted slightly beside her, the movement subtle but noticeable now, his composure no longer seamless, his presence no longer defining. Naomi's gaze did not return to him. She did not need to address him for the message to reach him, because the entire room had already understood. She finished with a small, almost unnoticeable incline of her head, not a bow, not submission, but acknowledgement. Thank you for listening, she said simply, and then she released the microphone, the sound of it settling back into its stand softer than the silence that followed, because this silence was not empty, it was full of recognition, of recalibration, of a truth that had entered the room quietly and taken its place without asking for approval. And in that moment, Naomi Carter was no longer being seen through anyone else's narrative, she was the one defining it. The silence did not break immediately, it transformed, shifting from stillness into something far more deliberate, a recalibration that moved quietly through the room like a current no one could see but everyone could feel. One by one, people began to move, not away from Naomi, but toward her, the subtle repositioning of power unfolding in real time. A man in a tailored navy suit stepped forward first, his expression composed but no longer detached. Ms. Carter, he said, extending his hand with measured respect, I have followed your work in community infrastructure development for years. His voice carried just enough to be heard by those closest, and that was all it took. Others followed, conversation shifting direction, attention redirecting itself with quiet precision. The same individuals who had laughed moments earlier now adjusted their tone, their posture, their presence, because recognition had replaced assumption. Naomi accepted the handshake with a small, controlled nod, her response polite, professional, without flourish. She did not lean into the attention, she allowed it to come and settle on its own terms. Across the stage, William remained where he stood, his hands now resting at his sides, the card still held loosely between his fingers, but no longer relevant. His role in the room had changed in a way that no strategy could reverse. He watched as the space around Naomi filled, not with noise, but with intention. Investors, board members, individuals whose approval he had once commanded now redirected their focus without hesitation. It was not betrayal, it was alignment, the natural movement of influence toward where it truly belonged. William took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on Naomi, searching perhaps for a sign, a reaction, something that might ground him back into the narrative he understood. But she did not look back, not yet. She was engaged in conversation, her voice low, steady, her presence unchanged, as if this shift had always been inevitable, as if the room was simply catching up to a reality she had never questioned. A woman in a silver gown leaned in slightly, her tone respectful. Your education initiative in Detroit, is it expanding into the Midwest region next year? Naomi answered with clarity, not rehearsed, not performative, but informed. Precise. It is already underway, she said. We are focusing on scalability before visibility. The words carried a quiet authority, the kind that comes from execution rather than intention. Nearby, another voice joined, and the healthcare partnerships in Texas. Naomi turned slightly, acknowledging each question without losing her center, without rushing, without overextending. Her presence remained consistent, controlled, as if she were standing in a space she had always owned, because she was. William shifted his weight, the movement. Subtle but noticeable now, the room no longer oriented around him, his earlier words lingering in the air like something out of place, something that no longer fit the current reality. He glanced briefly toward a familiar face in the crowd, a board member who had once mirrored his confidence, but the man's attention was elsewhere now, focused on Naomi, engaged, interested, aligned. The shift was complete, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. William lowered his gaze for a moment, the polished surface of the stage reflecting a version of himself he no longer recognized, not because he had changed, but because the room had, and for the first time, he was not leading that change. Naomi's conversation paused briefly as she felt it, the weight of his gaze, not demanding, not calling, simply present. She turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his across the small distance that now felt far greater than it had moments before. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction. Only clarity, the kind that does not seek acknowledgement because it does not require it. William held her gaze, the silence between them different now, no longer controlled, no longer defined by him. He took a step forward, just one, as if closing the distance might restore something, but the space remained unchanged, because it was not physical, it was understood. Naomi inclined her head slightly, not in deference, but in recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of a moment that had already passed. And then she turned back to the room, to the conversations, to the people who now saw her not as an extension, but as a center, and in that simple movement, the final line was drawn, not with words, not with confrontation, but with direction, because power, when it is real, does not argue, it simply moves, and the world moves with it. The room no longer felt like a stage, it felt like a shift in gravity, and William stood at the edge of it, no longer the center but the observer of something he could not redirect. Conversations continued around Naomi with a steady rhythm, names exchanged, ideas discussed, respect offered without hesitation, and each interaction reinforced the same undeniable truth: she had never needed the room to validate her. The room was now adjusting to her presence. William's fingers finally released the card, letting it rest against his side. The crisp edge now softened from the pressure he had unconsciously applied. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more than air, it carried realization. He had built his life on control, on reading rooms, on anticipating outcomes before they unfolded, but this had slipped past him entirely, not because it was hidden, but because he had never thought to look. His gaze returned to Naomi, watching the way she listened, the way she responded, not with urgency, not with performance, but with certainty. Every word she spoke grounded in something real, something earned, and for the first time, he began to see the pattern he had ignored, the late nights she had spent working without explanation, the calls she had taken in quiet corners, the way she had moved through his world without ever trying to belong to it, because she had already built her own. The memory surfaced without warning. A conversation months ago in their penthouse overlooking the city. She had mentioned a partnership, something about expanding access, something about scale, and he had nodded without listening. Too focused on his own projections, his own timelines, he had reduced her words to background noise, just as he had reduced her presence tonight to something he could shape. And now, standing here, he understood the cost of that assumption. It was not just a mistake. It was a misjudgment of something far greater than he had allowed himself to recognize. A man approached him. Then, one of his longtime investors, his expression neutral but his tone different. "William," he said, extending a hand, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi before returning. "I was not aware of the connection." The words were polite, but the implication was clear. The alignment had shifted. William accepted the handshake, his grip firm, his expression controlled. "Neither was I," he replied, and for the first time that evening, his words were not calculated, they were simply true. The man nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, and then turned his attention away, moving toward Naomi with quiet purpose. William watched him go, the movement small but significant, another piece of the room realigning itself. He straightened slightly, instinctively, as if posture alone could restore something, but it did not, because this was not about appearance, it was about perception. and perception had already changed. Across the room, Naomi's voice carried. Again, calm, steady, answering a question about long-term sustainability, her words precise, her tone measured. There was no need to elevate her voice. The room had already lowered itself to listen. William took a step forward, then stopped. The distance between them no longer defined by space but by understanding. He realized then that what he had mistaken for simplicity in her was actually discipline. What he had dismissed as quiet was actually control, and what he had overlooked entirely was the depth of what she had built without ever asking for recognition. A flicker of something unfamiliar moved through him, not regret in the dramatic sense, but something sharper, more immediate, the awareness of having misjudged something essential. He glanced around the room again, taking in the subtle shifts, the way conversations had reoriented, the way attention now flowed toward her without effort. This was not a reversal driven by spectacle. It was a correction driven by truth, and truth, once revealed, did not negotiate. Naomi paused briefly, as if sensing the shift in him without needing to see it, her gaze lifting for a moment, meeting his again across the space, and in that look, there was no question, no expectation, only clarity, the kind that does not wait for acknowledgement, because it does not depend on it. William held that gaze for a second longer than before, and in that second, something settled. Not resolution, not yet, but recognition, the kind that marks the beginning of understanding. And then Naomi turned back to the conversation, her attention returning to the room, to the work, to the future she was already shaping, leaving him standing in the quiet space between what he had believed and what he now knew, a space where the only thing left to do was see clearly, even if it came too late. The air in the ballroom had changed completely, not with noise, but with alignment, the kind that happens when a room quietly corrects itself, and William could feel it in every subtle movement around him, the way conversations no longer circled back to him, the way familiar faces no longer sought his reaction before forming their own. He stood still for a moment longer, watching Naomi not as his wife, not as an extension of anything he understood, but as a force he had failed to recognize, and that failure now stood in full view, undeniable and precise. The music resumed softly in the background, but it no longer defined the rhythm of the room. Naomi did, her presence setting the tone without effort, guiding conversations not through dominance but through clarity, a quiet authority that did not need to assert itself to be followed. William took a step forward again, this time continuing, closing the distance between them not out of instinct, but out of necessity, because standing still had become its own form of retreat. Naomi noticed him before he spoke, her awareness immediate, her attention shifting with the same controlled grace that defined everything she did. The conversation around her softened, not because she asked for it, but because the room recognized the moment. William stopped just in front of her, close enough now that the space between them carried weight again, but it was different, no longer defined by assumption. He held her gaze, and for a brief moment, the room faded, not completely, but enough to allow something more direct to exist. Naomi, he said, her name no longer used as part of a performance, but as an acknowledgement, his voice lower now, stripped of projection. She did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of control, allowing the moment to settle before engaging it, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. I was not aware, he continued, the words measured, chosen carefully, but no longer calculated for effect, of what you have built. It was not an apology, not yet, but it was a shift, a step away from certainty into something more honest. Naomi listened, not interrupting, not softening, simply present. William exhaled slowly, the weight of the realization settling into something more defined. That is not an excuse, he added, and this time, there was no performance in his tone, only recognition. The kind that arrives when denial is no longer possible. Naomi's gaze did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight straightening, not defensive, but clarifying, as if the space between them required precision now, not assumption. No, she said, her voice calm, even, carrying no edge. It is not. The simplicity of the response held more weight than any extended explanation could have, because it did not escalate, it defined. William nodded once, absorbing the clarity of it, the absence of emotion in her response, not cold, but controlled, the kind that comes from understanding something fully and no longer needing to react to it. He glanced briefly around them, aware of the room again, aware that this moment, though quieter, was still being witnessed, not as spectacle, but as consequence. He lowered his voice slightly, not to hide, but to focus. I misjudged you, he said, the words direct, unembellished, and for the first time that evening, entirely unguarded. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring not the words, but the space they occupied. Then she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting or rejecting it, because acknowledgement was not the same as agreement. "You did," she replied, her tone unchanged, steady, without accusation, without softness, simply true. The exchange lasted only seconds, but within it, everything that had shifted in the room was mirrored in miniature. The redefinition of perception, the removal of assumption, the arrival of clarity. William felt it settle, not as resolution, but as reality, the kind that does not ask to be comfortable, only to be seen. Naomi's attention moved back to the people around her, not dismissing him, but not centering him either, her world continuing without pause, without disruption, because it had never depended on his recognition to exist. William remained where he stood for a moment longer, the distance between them no longer something to close, but something to understand, and in that understanding, he realized something that had never occurred to him before. That power, real power, did not come from being seen first, it came from being undeniable when finally seen, and Naomi had never needed the room to turn in her favor, the room had simply caught up to what had always been true. The music continued, soft and refined, but no longer the defining sound of the evening, because something far more lasting had already taken its place, the quiet recalibration of a room that had witnessed a truth it could not ignore. Naomi moved through the space with the same measured grace she had carried from the moment she entered, her conversations now fewer, more intentional, as if the purpose of the night had already been fulfilled and everything else was simply a continuation, not a performance, not a correction, just presence, the kind that does not linger to be validated. Across the ballroom, guests adjusted in subtle ways, some stepping closer to her orbit, others stepping back into reflection, but no one returned to what had existed before, because once a room has seen clearly, it cannot unsee. William remained near the stage for a moment longer, the distance between where he stood and where Naomi moved now defined by more than space, it was defined by understanding, by the recognition of something he had overlooked not because it was hidden, but because he had never considered it necessary to look. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the evening settling into something quieter, more internal. He had spent years building influence, shaping perception, controlling narratives, but none of that had prepared him for a moment where none of those tools applied, because this was not about control, it was about truth, and truth did not require permission. He stepped down from the stage, his movements deliberate, no longer driven by urgency, but by awareness. The crowd parted slightly as he moved, not out of deference, but out of natural adjustment, the same way it had adjusted around Naomi earlier, the difference now unmistakable. He paused near a table where a few of his longtime associates stood, their expressions polite, measured, but no longer anchored to him in the same way. One of them nodded in acknowledgement. "Quite an evening," the man said, his tone neutral, but the meaning layered. William inclined his head slightly. "It is," he replied, and the simplicity of his response reflected the shift within him, no longer filling space with certainty, but allowing space for what was real. His gaze moved again across the room, finding Naomi without effort. She stood near the far side now, speaking with a smaller group, her posture unchanged, her presence consistent, as if the entire evening had been nothing more than a moment of alignment rather than a turning point, and perhaps for her, it was. William watched for a second longer, not with the intent to approach, not with the need to correct, but with the understanding that some moments were not meant to be revisited, they were meant to be recognized. Naomi finished her conversation, offering a final nod, a brief exchange of gratitude, and then she stepped away, her path clear, not because the room parted dramatically, but because it naturally made space for her movement. She did not rush, did not linger, she simply walked, each step steady, each motion unforced, the exit ahead framed by soft light, the doors opened just enough to suggest transition rather than departure. William felt it then, the finality of the moment, not as loss, but as clarity, the kind that arrives when something has fully revealed itself and there is nothing left to interpret. Naomi reached the edge of the ballroom, pausing only briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge the space she was leaving behind, her hand resting lightly against the door as she stepped through, the light beyond catching the edge of her silhouette before she disappeared from view, the doors closing softly behind her, the sound quiet, but definitive. William remained where he was, the room continuing around him, conversations resuming, music carrying on, but nothing returning to what it had been, because the narrative had shifted, and in that shift, something permanent had been established. He lowered his gaze for a moment, then lifted it again, not searching this time, not expecting, simply seeing, and in that clarity, one truth remained, steady and undeniable. Respect had not been given that night, it had been revealed, and once revealed, it could never be taken back.